All right, we'll get started. It's not fair for those who come on time to have to wait too long for those who come late. Uh, so we will start off this evening, as usual, talking about the Torah portion of the upcoming week. And excuse me, it's really a fascinating portion because after we have the whole story of Sinai and the thunder and lightning and all the sound effects of Har Sinai, we now turn to something seems much more prosaic, and which is essentially a discussion or listing of everyday laws, laws for a community, laws for a country, city, state. We have to bear in mind when we look at this that this is dealing with a world that's 3,000 years ago. So certain aspects of what is taken for granted within this framework of laws is based upon the general society around Israel. So, for example, there are laws dealing with slavery, because that was part of the ancient world. Women are clearly at a certain social disadvantage, again, because that was the reality of the ancient world. And as I always refer to Maimonides' wonderful understanding that, you can only go so far in revolutionary thought in rearranging society. And so the Torah has to begin with a world in which Israel exists in order to create a society that ultimately perhaps will get to a better level than at that time. So it starts off, the Elam Mishpatim Asher Tasim, these are the judgments, laws that you will place before them. All right, so it says the general introduction to what's going to follow are these the rules, the judgments that they're supposed to give to Israel. It begins with Kitikne Eved Ivri, when a man acquires a Hebrew slave, or when one acquires a Hebrew slave. We have to first of all understand, because it says he's going to work for you for 6 years. What kind of slave works for 6 years and goes free at the 7th year? So this is really kind of an indentured servant arrangement. And so they're given rules, because in that day and age, well, up until not so long ago, we had indentured servants as part of the reality of the world. The rabbis interpret this usually to refer to somebody who had committed a crime, couldn't pay his debt off as a result of the crime, and so he would be sold as an indentured servant for a period of time. So we have laws of a man is sold as an indentured servant, and then it turns to the woman. If a woman is not exactly the same situation, it says when a man sells his daughter as a slave. Right, so first of all, it uses language again, ama, which is a female servant, whether it's a slave or not. And we'll see, I'm going to read it in its entirety so that you get a feel for it. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed as male slaves are. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to an outsider since he broke faith with her. And if he designated her for his son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. If he marries another, he must not withhold from this one her food or clothing or her conjugal rights. If he fails her in these 3 ways, she shall go free without payment. So it's very clear that this is not an indentured servant, and it's not the woman doing it herself, it's her father. And I won't go through the rabbinic interpretations and all details because they narrow it down very much. So, but broadly what it is implying that she is sold by her father to be a wife to either this man or to his son or somebody from his household. And if he doesn't treat her properly, he can't treat her like a slave. He can't sell her to somebody else. And if he doesn't live up to his obligations, she goes free. There's no penalty that he has to pay, giving money back to the father, what have you. In the ancient world, it was not uncommon, because the reality was an unmarried woman, unless she was with her father in her father's household, which clearly at a societal disadvantage. And that was just the reality of the ancient world. Women were either attached in some way to their father's household, or to their husband. A single woman on her own 3,000 years ago was really pretty much unheard of, right? Because she had no property, she couldn't own land, she couldn't make a living except through prostitution, which sometimes is one of the few cases where you find free women mentioned in the biblical accounts. So, and essentially, where the rabbis understood it, she is clearly being sent or sold, as it were, to this man as a wife, maybe not the first wife, maybe as a secondary wife. Again, we're talking about an age of polygamy. We'll talk more about polygamy when we come to marriage, because of course, in today's world, polygamy is forbidden. And we find in passing the requirements that a husband has to his wife. It says that if the man takes another wife, so Chaim marries Sarah, the daughter of Yitzchak. Okay? So Sarah he buys her to be a wife. And, unfortunately, sometimes men get greedy or what have you, and he decides, I want another wife. Sarah's now no longer as beautiful as she was when I first married her. Of course, the rabbis understood that she has to be under the age of 12, or this is invalid to start with. Okay. He may not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. These are the three rights that Jewish tradition says are obligations that a man has to his wife. He has to provide her with food, has to provide her with clothing, and he has to provide her with sexual relations. And if a man denies any of those three items, when we come to when we talk about the laws of divorce, she has a right to petition the court saying, my husband is not treating me properly. And court can respond to that misbehavior on his part. Okay. So then we go on to a number of different rules, laws. He fatally strikes a man, should be put to death. If he did not do it by design, but it came about by an act of God, and then there's some sign of accident, I will assign a place to which he can flee. But when men plot against another and kills him treacherously, you shall take him from my very altar to be put to death. The ancient world, the altar of a temple was a very sacred site. And it was a place of refuge. We find this today in the modern sense in the church, the idea that the church can be a sanctuary. The Torah is saying, no, if a person is guilty of plotting murder, there's no sanctuary for him in the synagogue or in the temple of Israel or any other place. He is guilty for his own life. Now, we got a number of different laws. I'm not going to go through all of them. They're very clearly laws of society. The Talmud spends a lot of time discussing a lot of these laws because they were the structure of society in the ancient world. I want to look at one more passage in a little more detail. So it says a little bit later on in the Torah portion, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results. Okay, so it's when the two men are struggling. V'nagfu isha hara. So a man, one of the guys who in this fight pushes against, strikes this woman. And now the Hebrew says, literally, Eitzu Yiladeha, her child goes out. Literally, it means the child goes out. But Now they're translating it following Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition, as a miscarriage, right? The woman's pregnant, two guys are fighting, one accidentally hits this other woman and causes a miscarriage. But no other damage ensues. Otherwise, apparently there's nothing else to the woman. She's not hurt, injured in any other way. The one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband. All right. As the woman's husband may exact from him the payment to be based on reckoning. So the Torah says that if the only result of this is a miscarriage, then the husband has a claim, a monetary claim against the culprit for doing this. Right? No, it is accidental, and that makes a difference on things too. Right? Because we saw before that an accidental murder, which is not intentional homicide, right? You're not guilty of a capital crime. Okay, so now it says here so far, there's a miscarriage, there's no other injury, so some kind of penalty, it goes to court apparently, and the husband tries to get money from the culprit. But if other damage ensues, now if we're assuming that right now we're reading this to mean some other damage to the woman, she's harmed in some way, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And the famous lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law of the Torah. Now, a couple of things I want to first have to mention. We just got through suggesting that this was an accident. So even if she were unfortunately to die, since it was an accident, how can it be life for life? How can the man be executed for an accidental death? Because that's made clear earlier that that's not done. And so and then it goes on to say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And the rabbis reasoned this way. If I put out your eye, all right, so you can put out my eye. What if I put out 50% of the vision of your right eye? How can the court put out 50% of the vision of your right eye? It's impossible. There's no way a court could impose such a penalty. And so the rabbis understood this to mean that this is all talking about monetary restitution. The injury that is suffered by the woman is recompensed monetarily. How do you determine that? Well, in their day and age, they said you go to the local slave market and you would say this woman on the slave market would be equal X amount of money, or this man, depending on who's injured, is worth X amount of money in good health. If he lost an eye, how much is his value devalued? Okay? And the difference between his value with the good eye versus the value without the good eye, that's the penalty. Now, there are other things too, depending on the circumstances. The rabbis talk about paying for healing, they talk about paying for shame, all kinds of other things. But I just want to get to the basic understanding here in the rabbinic reading of it is that one, there was a miscarriage, and apparently the fetus dies. No other injury. I get some beautiful stories going on and watching these, you guys, Lakin's getting a nice, he's kissing everybody there. Okay. They're such sweet dogs, I know. All right. Where was I before I got distracted? Okay. Monetary restitution equivalent to the pain and suffering that the individual suffered. Okay. So miscarriage, unfortunate death of the fetus, is one case. Injury to the woman is a second case. The injury to the woman is much more severely regarded in the law than the death of the fetus. This is the so now I will come back to this passage in a moment, but I just want to read to you very quickly. I won't put it on the screen, but there's a Mishnah, and we're going to talk about the Mishnah later on. It says if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they can cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. Okay, so now this passage, Halot, says that there's some kind of problem when the woman's giving birth. The child has not yet entered to, about to come forth through the birth canal. And in order to save the woman's life, you are allowed to destroy the fetus. Now, Jewish law, building upon what we read in the Torah a moment ago, this passage from Mohalot and others, first of all, understands that abortion is not only permitted under certain circumstances, but it may be even required under certain circumstances. I.e., a woman having difficulty giving birth, and you have no other way to save her life, and the fetus is not yet come out into the world, it's not yet fully separate individual from its mother. Therefore, you're allowed to destroy the fetus to preserve her life. Her life comes first. Two people of equal circumstance, well, you can't choose one over the other. If the child has begun to be born, if the head has come out, it's entered into the world, it's now become a separate being, a separate entity, and the story changes. Now, in Jewish law and tradition, there are a range of views on how far this goes. On the most extreme, narrowest interpretation, based upon some of the rabbinic understandings of it, the only time an abortion is warranted is when it's necessary to save the mother's life and nothing else can be done. Anything short of that, abortion would not be permitted. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that the mother's life and well-being is paramount. She comes first. As long as the fetus has not yet entered into the world, you can regard the fetus as a limb of the mother. Is this where your hand? And if you have a cancer in your hand, for example, or you've got gangrene that's come into your hand, if you have to amputate the hand to save the person's life, we amputate the hand. So if the fetus, the continuing of the pregnancy, jeopardizes the woman in some serious way, even to some rabbis will say, even if it means to her mental well-being, if she keeps the fetus, she goes to full term, her psychological health can be seriously damaged, then that might be warrant for an abortion. And then the various opinions that fall between those two extremes. Only the death of the mother is at hand if you continue the pregnancy. If serious damage in some way, physical or mentally, can come to the woman on the other hand. That's the bulk of Jewish rabbinic responses to this day fall in between those two extremes. All right, those two ends of the spectrum, not extremes, ends of the spectrum. so that we find in Jewish literature very clearly situations in which rabbis would say this an abortion is not only warranted, but may be mandatory to save her life. Okay? Now, the Catholic Church and others look at this passage in the Bible a little bit differently, and their interpretation does have what to stand on, as we say in Jewish speech. Yeah, because it is a little ambiguous. Two men are fighting. One pushes a woman. The fetus comes out, and there is no other injury. So they read it, the child is born premature as a result of the injury, but there's nothing else that happens, and there's some kind of penalty that the responsible individual has to pay. But if there's any injury to the fetus, life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, etc. So that's the way that Catholic Church, for example, has interpreted this passage, thus giving their approach very restrictive on abortion. That the fetus is regarded as a full-fledged human being from conception, and there is Jewish law and interpretations that support that position. And therefore, you can never sacrifice the fetus for the mother under any circumstances. That's their approach to the story. But we start from the same spot in the Bible, and you see how different traditions go in different directions. What you will not find here, to be fair, is support for the idea that a woman has full control over her own body. No one has full control over their own body. Jewish law does not permit suicide. If I don't like the way my hand looks, I'm not allowed just to chop it off. I can't damage myself because I really, I just, whatever reason. So that rabbis have discussed and dealt with questions of cosmetic surgery. Under what circumstances are cosmetic surgery permitted? Because you're injuring yourself in order to do so. Some, again, are very lenient and say, if something about your looks are such that it really disturbs you, then that might be grounds for cosmetic surgery. All right? But if you just want to look a little bit younger, a little bit better for the world, rabbinic tradition would frown on that kind of thing. Because no one owns their body. God owns our bodies. We have a responsibility to care for it properly. And therefore, there's a limit what we can do, even to ourselves. All right, so that comes from this. We're going to talk about rabbinic literature tonight after we go over our Hebrew, and we'll see how, at least a little bit of how that goes into action this evening. All right, not that case, but other situations. All right. So I sent out the Hebrew, so those who do not yet have their books on hand. Whoops, I have to share the screen. There we go. Share. Okay. We are up to page 40, according to my review of what we did the last time we did Hebrew. So this is a review page. So everybody, please unmute yourselves. Okay. And everybody, please unmute yourselves. I want to hear you. Some are, I can see when your microphone's not on, people. There's still, all right, there's still some of you who don't want to unmute. All right. Anyway, all right. Well, okay. Okay, so line number 1, we have the word boats, retivut, itzpeh, linshon. Line number 2, nefesh, yivhuv, shachav, chav, toreif, toreifa. In Yiddish, toreif becomes treif. That's treif or treifa. Not meaning that treif really means to be torn. In that usage, it means something's unkosher because of some reason. All right, line number 3. Chevra, chaverut, devarim, botzets, geneva. Okay. Line number 4. Tiftuf, tachana, tiul, tiach, right? Because of the chetz at the end there, that's why it's tiach, right? And the last word on that line is tif. Line number 5. Chativa, l'chaim. When you have a drink with everybody and you want to say shkol or whatever, what do we say in Hebrew? We say l'chaim. Okay. And what was that? L'chaim. Good luck. Okay. 5. The third word is chait. Chatoteret. Teret. That's a long word, yeah. Chatoteret. Okay. Line number 6. Hechalit. Keshet. Chalutza. Hechalutz. Chiluf. Line 7. Elohei. Avraham. Yitzchak. Yaakov. Elohei. And you see, this is part of the Amidah. All right, line number 8. Ve'ahavta. Levavcha. Nafshecha. Me'odecha. Anochi. All right, line number 9. Mitzavcha. B'shivtecha. Uvlechtecha. Uvshochbecha. Line 10. Uvkumecha. L'totafot. Elohechem. Emet. So some of you have been hearing words. This is the beginning of the Shema. All these words, 7 on down, are words from prayer that we do. 41. Whoops, that's not what I want. That was 39. What was it? That was 48. I guess it is.
Rabbi,
yeah.
So if a word begins with vet,
yeah,
or vav, does it always mean and? Like if the
letter vav at the beginning of a word, Hebrew can't, and some people who are translating the Hebrew like to always say and with it. Sometimes the vav is used as part of the grammatical change. It changes it from a past tense to a future tense, or from the future to the past tense. It's called a vav hifuch. Vayomer, yomer is he shall say or he says, imperfect. Amar is he said or perfect, the past tense. Vayomer changes it from he will say to he said. Amar changes it from he said to he will say. So in those cases, it should not be translated except on the way it affects the word. The letter bet, is that what you're asking us about the letter vet?
Well, I was just wondering, like the V sound in general. So whether it's a vav
not
or
at
a
all.
vet,
Only the vav. Only the vav
Only the
is
vav.
is the and. Can use for and. The bet, at the beginning of a word, remember at the beginning of a word like Baruch, that's what we're going to look at right now. At Baruch, it has to have a dot in. It has to be a b. Now, if it had a vowel sound before it, for example, he is blessed, hu varuch, the dot drops out because of the vowel sound in front of it. All right.
So no word can start with a vet. It can only start with a bet.
Correct. Unless it's following a vowel sound.
And then, so like the word like b'mitzvotav would be just be like,
well, here's
b'mitzvotav. With his, right? With, right?
The letter here, b, can mean with or in.
Okay.
He is sanctified as in or with or through his commandments. The word is mitzvah. Mitzvot is the plural. B'mitzvot means with commands. B'mitzvotav with his commands. So there's one word in English.
Seems like 3 words.
Yeah. Okay. That's why usually when you have translations in English anyway, the Hebrew is almost always shorter than the English translations.
And then the next word there is the vav acting as an and he commands us.
Yeah. B'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, and he commanded us. But that's how we usually read it. All right? And he commanded us. Or through his, he sanctified us through his commandments and commanded us lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, to light the Chanukah licht, Chanukah candles. Okay, so we're introducing another vowel. It's called a kubutz. It's 3 dots under the word on an angle, and that's an oo sound, just like this one. Technically, this is the long vowel form, and this is the short vowel form. The difference being, when you have the short vowel form, that's going to be the consonant that follows it as part of that syllable usually. All right, we'll see as we go along. Okay. Sometimes there's other things. All right, so it's an oo sound just like the other one. Okay, so line number 1. We're going to go to the lu, okay? Please don't do that right now, though. All right, line number 1. Lu, hu, u, hu, nu, mu, su, tu, vu, ku, and do. Oh, sounds like a lot of baby talk here. My 1-year-old grandson was with us yesterday, and that's what he was saying, a lot of. Okay, line number 2. Boots, roots, goof, oof, ove, shuv, toof. Yeah. Line number 3. Valoon, Tul, Pu'al,
Ruach.
ruach, chuppah.
Chuppah.
So, now, since this is a short vowel here, the letter fe is actually doubled because we need a chuf and a fa. Okay? That's what's happening. So what happens is instead of writing two pays, we put a dot in the pay that tells us it's doubled, but we can't say f. So now it becomes a p. I'm sure that's clear as mud to everybody, but that's what's going on. Okay. All right. Was there a question? All right.
How would you pronounce that? Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Can you say how you'd pronounce that?
Chuppah. You pronounce it as if it's two syllables. Chu and then pa. Okay. But technically that's a short syllable, so it really needs a consonant to finish it. So that's one of those strange things in Hebrew. We have a few strange.
That's that word. That's chuppah, like the wedding.
Canopy, a canopy.
Yeah.
Okay. And in case of weddings, that's the wedding canopy, the chuppah. All right. And after the chuppah, you go to stay at the hotel. That's the malon. Line number 4. Malon,
Malon.
chatul.
Chatul.
I hope the dog didn't hear that. That's a cat. Surah,
Zra.
chukat,
Chukat.
shira,
Ra.
teva.
Teva.
Line number 5. Shituf,
Yituf.
tirdof,
Tirdof.
pitzutz,
Pitzutz.
avka, rechula. Line 6. Lachatz, munach, kubutz, shuruk, chirik. Right, so those are the names of the vowels. Kubutz is the first vowel there. Shuruk is that first vowel there after the shin. Chirik is the dot with yud. All right. Line number 7. Bechira, Shavatz, Anochi, Metuyal, Tiyulim. All right, that's 42. Okay, we're still working on the bracha of the candles for Hanukkah. So the letter Chaf, with a dot in it, it becomes a K sound. All right. Just like in Hanukkah, that K that you have at the end of Hanukkah, towards the end there, all right? One of the numerous ways to spell Hanukkah. All right. So it can have a dot or not have a dot. If there's a dot in it, it's an air stop. K. K. If there's no dot in it, it's not an air stop, so it's going to be instead of saying k, you say k. Right? The air keeps going through. That's the difference, really. Okay, so line number 1. Ka, ka, k, ka, ku, ko, kai. Line number 2. Kor, Cain, Kad, Ko, Kav, Kach, Kikar. Oh, that's a Kach. I'm sorry. Yeah, Kikar, Kav, no, Kach, and Kikar. I'm getting a little hairy here. Okay, line number 3. Bakar, Bachar, Bachar, Bihar.
Bachar.
Bahar.
You did this intentionally because you have Bikar, Bihar, and now another Bahar, and this one's just a har, Bahar. All those words you could get
Bahar.
confused with. Okay,
Batur.
Bator
Bator.
and Bator.
Four.
Okay, line number 4. Batur,
Batur.
Batur.
Batur,
Batur.
Kelev.
Caleb.
Anybody know what
Did you hear
Kelev
that?
means?
Dog.
Dog. That's a he dog though. Kalba is the feminine. When I was in Hebrew school way in
Forgot about
18th
that.
century, we of course looked up the feminine for a dog so we could all chuckle at it in the back of the school Hebrew school bus. Okay. Kalba, yeah. Okay. It doesn't mean it has that meaning whatsoever in Hebrew. There's nothing. Actually, if you raise dogs, you talk about it, the bitches. Okay. Okay, right? Yeah, that's the female dog. No, okay. The next word, the bride, hakala,
Akala.
atsu.
Atsu.
I hope she's not atsuva. I hope she's not unhappy because she's, and vered.
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 Okay, line number 5. Shiva,
Shiva.
Shiva.
Shiva,
Shiva.
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 So notice again, we have 3 words spelled differently, all pretty much pronounced the same. Shiva, Shiva, and Shiva. If you had pronounced the ayin, you would get a Shiva on it. Right?
Geneva.
The 4th word is ma'arav, geneva. Line number 6, kaveh, divrei, kavana, kivun, mitkavein, and kadur. Right? So again, just how these things work. Kavana means intention, having an intent, being attentive to something. You pray, you should ideally pray with kavana. You should really have in mind what you're doing, what you're saying. Kivun is to direct yourself, all right, to direct, and that's same word root. And mitkave means what you intend to do. So all of those come from the same root word, kufav, kafav nun. And now the last line, we have kavash, lihit konein, koach, koev, and kochav. Kochav, a nice star. And 43. Okay. So we have the Hebrew blessing for Hanukkah licht. It's a little bit past Hanukkah now, but let us all read it together. We have Baruch, Atah, Adonai, Eloheinu, Melech Haolam, Asher Kidshanu, B'mitzvotav, B'tzivanu, Lehadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. All right, so here are what all the words mean. We've had them before. All right, these are not new words except the word Chanukah. Really, all the rest of them we've come across, and we're supposed to sort of learn them, right? I think. All right, I'm gonna let me just close these particular windows.
Well, Robert, I have one other question. The hay with the dagesh.
Yeah.
In the book, it says you're just like when a word ends with the hay with the dagesh, you're supposed to pronounce the H sound.
Yeah.
Like how would that even sound?
Well, but not, for example, we have her son. Ben is son. Shelah is her. So you want to make a combination of into one word. You have benah. Benah. You just kind of put on it because there's an sound before it. So you just kind of on and the end of it. It's not real common that you'll have people doing that. If you listen to a very good Torah reader, especially, you will hear a very good Torah reader being very careful, no matter which way they pronounce it, Ashkenaz and Sfardit, to get those kamatz hey, the chataf hey, it's called, not a chataf, mapik hey, mapik hey. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about rabbinic literature. And when we look at rabbinic literature in general, we have the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. That is something that we can all physically see. We all recognize. You don't have to be Jewish to be cognizant of the first 5 books of the Bible. That is called in Hebrew the Torah. Now, Jewish tradition speaks of the Torah shebichtav and the Torah sheba'al peh. The written Torah, which includes the Tanakh, really, although essentially it's the 5 books of Moses. But it's expanded in meaning to really the entire Tanakh. The entire Bible sometimes is referred to as the written Torah, although the rabbis make clear when they're talking about something that's in the Torah text versus something in other books of the Bible. And then you have something, those little more amorphous, called the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. The rabbis themselves discuss and make clear that there's a certain ambiguity surrounding the oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh. And there are 2 different stories or 2 different sayings, a saying and a story found in rabbinic literature in the Talmud that illustrate this sense of ambiguity. One passage says that anything that any student of Torah is going to come up with, any insight, any new interpretation of God's Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the written Torah, that anybody in the future, including us today, if we come up with a new insight, it was already revealed to Moses at Sinai. Just like last week we said in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. There is nothing that was not revealed to Moses at Sinai. The Torah describes Moses going up to Sinai. We're told in the thunder and the lightning and all of that, the giving of the 10 Commandments, Aseret HaDibrot. But Moshe goes up for another 40 days and nights. What is he up there for all that time? He's learning the Torah Sheba'al Peh. God is revealing to him all of the interpretations that are not written down in the Torah. For example, and it's very clearly, nowhere in the Torah does it say that tefillin have to have black on the boxes and on the straps. Now, we do interpret the Torah as saying you have to wear, ukshartam liyota yadecha, you should bind them as a sign upon your hand. And they shall be for totafot, for some kind of signs, symbols between your eyes. That's written clearly in the Torah. But it doesn't say they have to be black leather. And the rabbis say in the Talmud, it's Allah Moshe Sinai. This is the law going back to Moses at Sinai that was already revealed to Moses at Sinai, that aspect of the oral law. Now, there's another story that says when Moshe goes up to Har Sinai to get the Torah, he has this vision of God putting little crowns on some of the letters of the Torah. The Torah is written, certain letters have extra signs on them, we call them tagim, crowns in Hebrew. And so Moshe says to God, why are you putting that on the letters? he says, because there's going to be a great rabbi who's going to come along. He's going to interpret all kinds of things based upon this. So Moshe seems, there must be somebody, this must be a great man, this great rabbi, show him to me. So God says, turn around. So Moshe turns around, he finds himself in the schoolhouse of Rabbi Akiva. And he sits down at the last row where those who don't know, the newest students in the back. And Moshe doesn't understand the thing that's going on. He turns around, he goes back, God, I thought you were going to show me what happened to my Torah. And this man, he said, patience, Moses, patience. So Moshe turns around, goes back, finds himself in the back row of the schoolhouse of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is going on. And finally, one of the students said, but Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? And Rabbi Akiva responds, Halach Moshe Sinai. It's a law that was revealed to Moses at Sinai. And Moses is happy. Now, the story implies that Moses didn't even understand what Rabbi Akiva was talking about. But Rabbi Akiva says it goes back to Moses at Sinai. So how can that be if everything was clearly revealed to Moses? So that indicates that the rabbis were aware there's a certain kind of development. And it has its roots in divine revelation at Sinai, but it is not exactly something that was said directly, clearly spelled out to Moses. So those are two ends of rabbinic extremes. Everything was revealed, the basics were, things come about. Now let me suggest the following. No matter what, any written document, any law code has to be interpreted. The words have to have meaning. And so, for example, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, we have to understand, what does it mean by eye for an eye, tooth for tooth? Can we read it, make it literal? I gave you the rabbinic interpretation of it. But in the Code of Hammurabi, there's a law code found from the Sumerian era called the Code of Hammurabi. And in the Code of Hammurabi, they have clearly an eye for an eye attitude. If a builder builds a house and the house collapses and it kills the owner of the house's daughter, the daughter of the builder of the house is executed. Eye for an eye, exactly. In law, I don't remember we have any attorneys out there, but we have a thing that's, you have black letter law. You have what the legislature, the parliament writes as a law. But judges also have a history of common law, things that were decided and became part of the unwritten laws of the land. So minimally, the Torah Shebaal Peh is the information necessary to understand what is in the written Torah itself. In Deuteronomy it said, if a man finds something unseemly about his wife and he writes her a sefer kritut, and she goes out and marries another man, or and he divorces her or dies, she can never go back to the first husband. All right. What is a sefer kritut? What constitutes a bill of divorce? It doesn't say. Certainly, it had to be that people were aware of what the meaning was of this. So the minimal Torah Shebaal Peh starts with the basic knowledge needed to understand the written word. And as most modern scholars suggest, as time went on, it builds up on those basic roots and grows. So the two attitudes are either everything that the rabbi says, Torah Sinai, all the Torah Shebaal Peh was revealed to Moses at Sinai, or that idea that there's a certain kind of development in the interpretation of the Torah. Now, by standard understanding, the biblical period as far as the rabbis were concerned, ends around 333 BCE. That's when Alexander the Great conquers the Middle East. The world begins to change, and anything that comes after that period of time, the rabbis said, cannot be part of the Tanakh, part of the Bible. And by tradition, we see rabbinic history following that time as divided up into different periods. Somewhere in the neighborhood between 200, around 200 before the Common Era, was a period of the Zugot, the Great Sanhedrin, or the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the Great Synagogue. These were the leadership of the rabbinic groups, or not. These were the leaders of Israel, at least on the Torah side of the scale. Around the beginning of the Common Era is the age of the Tanaim. The word Tana means to repeat. It's an Aramaic word. And it's an Aramaic word. And the Hebrew of that word is Shana, Mishnah. So the rabbis who lived between the years 0, whatever that means, to around 200, 225 of the Common Era are called the Tanaim. They are the writers, or the rabbis who are mentioned and named in what we call Tanaitic literature, the Mishnah and the Midrash, etc. Following the age of the Tanaim is the age of Amoraim. Now, the Tanaim are almost all in the land of Israel, though we do know some came from Babylonia, but they were active in Israel. Amoraim come from both Israel, land of Israel, and from Babylonia. And this period of time is a little hazy, and the more modern scholars are making it even hazier. I've been doing a lot of reading recently on the issue as to the full extent of how long the Amoraim go. But essentially, the Amoraim are the rabbis of the Talmudic era. What's most important to understand is if you have an argument, one Amorah, say Rava, says X, and Abaye says Y. Well, they're of equal authority. You can't say one's right, the other is wrong, and wrong, right? It's in and of itself that doesn't. But in their debate, they might note something that was said by one of the Tanaim. And if Rava refers to a Tana, a statement of a Tana, a Mishnah, a Braita, any of the works come from the Tanaitic period, and his partner in debate, Abaye, cannot cite a Tana who agrees with his position, he loses the debate. Because the authority of the Tanaim was considered to be greater than the authority of the Amoraim. I suppose, if you look, it's not quite the same, but let us say a court of appeals on the lower level cites a Supreme Court decision, or two lawyers are arguing in front of the judge, and lawyer A cites a decision by a higher court, and the other lawyer can't cite a different position from a higher court, he loses. But maybe he can interpret that decision in his favor, not the way the other guy wants to read it, but the way he reads it. That's what the Talmudic debate is all about. the rabbis trying to prove their point, often referring to the earlier generations. So now the Mishnah, which is a corpus of the oral law, is codified somewhere around 200 of the Common Era. There are other collections that we'll see later on, the Tosefta and the Midrash explanations about the Tanakh that are collected as late as the Middle Ages. But the Amoraim are the ones who are cited in the Talmud, and there are two Talmuds, the Talmud of the land of Israel and Talmud of Babylonia. That is edited, again, there's a lot of argument today how late it's edited, certainly before the year 800. Somewhere between 450 and 600, 650, 700, depends upon the scholar how late they want to push it to say the end of the Talmudic era actually comes about. Any rabbi from then on does not have the authority of a Talmudic rabbi. And then we talk about the age of the Gaonim. The Gaonim were the scholars in Babylonia after the close of the Talmud. And then somewhere after the year 1000, we have interpreters of rabbinic tradition. They're called the Rishonim, the early rabbis or the first scholars, the Rishonim. And everybody after the close of the Shulchan Aruch are called the Acharonim, including rabbis of today. I sent you a copy of this. If you haven't gotten it yet, you'll get it. Now, Midrash is different from Mishnah. We're going to look at that in a while. But Midrash is based upon explicating the biblical text. The Mishnah, for example, does not necessarily cite a word from the Torah. It gives you the law. When do we say the Shema at nighttime? From the time the stars come out at night, the words until the end of the first watch, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. There's no mention of a passage from the Torah. It's just what my teachers call apodictic law, a statement of law, without reference to the Bible. Midrash is an attempt to explicate what's in the Torah. It probably predates it certainly does predate the Mishnah, but the collections seem to be, for the most part, contemporaneous or later even than the Mishnah. And then you have two kinds of midrash. Now, again, we're going to look at it in detail. You have exegetical, which is trying to explain exactly what is in front of you, the words that appear in the Bible, where it may be. There's a list of some of those. Then they're homiletical. They're telling us how to behave, how to act, and they're not necessarily bound in the order of the text of the Torah. They're interested in general ideas more. And then you have narrative, which are collections usually of things that tell us the story about what takes place in the rabbinic period. So usually we usually refer to what we call midrash halacha, which is legal exegesis. What is the law that is found here in the biblical text? And midrash agadah is concerned with non-legal exegesis, explanations. And then there are two Talmuds in existence. One Talmud is referred to the Jerusalem Talmud or the Talmud of the Land of Israel. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud as an honor to Jerusalem, but it was clearly not written in Jerusalem. Indeed, Jerusalem at that time was a city forbidden to Jews. Some listed as lasting up until 450 of the Common Era. It's written in mostly Aramaic, but written in the Galilee. And so the Aramaic used is the dialect of the land of Israel. Then the Babylonian Talmud, which is edited much later on in what we call Babylonia in modern day Iraq. Now, when we say Talmud, normally we are referring to what we call the Babylonian Talmud. That became the major Talmud of study. Lots of reasons for it. We're not going to go into all of that. But I'm trying to remember the dating, I forget, but in Vilna, Lithuania, there was a family, Ram, the widow Ram and her sons, who had a printing operation, printing press, and their setup of the Talmud became the standard that we use today. Every Talmud, standard Talmud today, follows their pagination, their basic outline of what the text is supposed to look like. So this is the first page of the first tractate of the Talmud. We're going to look at it a bit later as well. The Talmud is printed as folios. This is page 2. It starts on page 2. Bet. And it's folios. Bet Amud Aleph, bet side 1 or A, and bet side 2. So if you will see a quotation, it might say Talmud. Usually they'll let you know it's Babylonian or Eretz Yisrael. Then it'll tell you what tractate, what volume it is in, which is this case is Brachot, the first dealing with blessings. And they will say Daf Bet Amud Aleph, page 2, side A. In Yiddish, the two sides of folio is called a blot. A blot Gemara would be the two sides, 2 folio pages. You may hear about, and I may have mentioned it, what we call Daf Yomi, the idea that every day we learn a page of Talmud. We're talking about a daf, the 2 sides. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, standard, although this was not original with the writing of the Talmud, we will have the Mishnaic passage that is going to be discussed by the rabbis of the Talmud. I'm trying to do this in a way that makes sense. Okay, it's got a fancy beginning at the top of the page there. Okay, this quotation in the blue is the Mishnah. We will see this in a little bit later tonight. That is then followed by so that's the Tanaim. That's what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had edited around the year 200, 225. That becomes the touchstone for study in the academies of both Israel and Babylonia. What then follows is sometimes referred to as Gemara or Talmud. Gemara is the Aramaic word for Talmud as well. It's the discussion of the Mishnah. And it's always these 2 parts are always in the middle of the page. Okay. There are 2 very important classic commentaries on the Talmud. The first and most important one was that of Rashi. We met Rashi before. We've talked about Rashi. He is in northern France, southwestern Germany. He is the father of Franco-German Jewry traditions after his time. His students, really his grandsons and their students become the Balei Tosafot, whose commentary we'll talk about in a moment. Rashi on the Talmud essentially tries to explain word for word, line for line, what is said in the Mishnah and then in the Talmud. He is always in the editions of the Talmud, his commentary is going to be next to the binding. So on the first side of the page, it's on the right. But when we flip the page over, it will be on the left because it's next to the binding. His is always next to the binding. Then, depending upon whether or not they have something to say, what they call the Balei Tosafot, students that come after him, their comments will be towards the outer side of the page. And then depending upon the edition of the Talmud, who's putting it together, what they want to, how they want to market it and everything like that, you will have some other commentary sometimes there on the page, sometimes further back in the back of the book, various commentaries, and over the ages. So now this is a pretty much standard size of the traditional Talmud. It's a nice big size volume. Okay. There are modern editions, smaller. Those of us who have problems with our eyes, it doesn't work so well. But that's a standard kind of size. But the Art Scroll and et cetera, and others have others here. Okay. So Rashi, as I said, is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Rabbi Solomon, son of Isaac, which Yitzchaki means, was born in Troyes in northern France in 1040, dies in Worms in 1105. And he studied in the various yeshivot of Troyes, Mainz, and Worms. Okay, and we won't go reading through all this. I hope you will read it. Famously, he did not have any sons, but he had 3 daughters. And according to legends, they were all scholars. And 2 of them married prominent Torah scholars. And so his grandsons were illustrious scholars such as Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam and Rabbi Samuel ben Rabbi Meir, the Rashbam. Yaakov Tam and they're brothers, only the Rashbam was quite a bit older than Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, Rashi dies around 1105. Rashi sought to explain the basic text without moving far away from what's going on the page. His grandsons and the other Balei Tosafot that goes on from the 12th to the 14th century, various editions of it. When a person studies Talmud, they usually just refer to the Tosafot. Although each Gemara, each section of the Talmud may have various different kinds of different versions of the Tosafot. But they, for the most part, Rashi's taking care of the basic explanations. What they are concerned with is sometimes disagreeing with what Rashi said. Sometimes they're interested in other issues, comparing one part of the Talmud with another. Sometimes they're interested in discussing how is it that we do X while the Talmud says we should do Y. There's also mentioned here that in Rashi's commentary on the Talmud and in the Tanakh, there are thousands of old French words that are transliterated into Hebrew, because sometimes Rashi wanted to explain something. And since his students spoke French of that era, that's how you're translated. Lashon Amzel Balaz, it's this. So those who are familiar with Old French, and as a matter of fact, even those, there are a lot of words that scholars of French sometimes have to decipher it because it got mixed up over the course of editing over the years by people who didn't know French. They can find especially words dealing with commonplace farm implements. You know, how many books in Old French talk about a hoe or a halter and things like that, and a feed bag. But Rashi had to translate some of these things into that. I'm going to stop here on the history of it. We'll come back to the history later on. But I want us to take a look at, let's see, stop share. And then I want to share something else. Whoops, again. Okay, share. That's not what I wanted. Okay, so I guess let's try again. Stop share. There we go. And I did that again. It's not what I want, is it? I want that pop up. Okay, stop share. Try this, close window. Okay, we're going to look at some of the examples. I think some of what we looked at tonight. Sorry, getting late, but I'll try and see how far we get. First, we're going to look at Midrash. As I said, Midrash was an attempt to explain what's found in the Bible. Now, there are different Midrashic collections, and some of them seem to be essentially sermons or that rabbis gave in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era. And they have a certain form that they follow, which is to begin with a passage from writings and then get to the Torah text that they want to talk about. So this is from Breshit Rabbah, which is Genesis, or the Great Genesis. Is a later, it's not one of the earlier collections. And this is from the section that begins with an explanation of the opening of Genesis. So it says, let's maybe get it a little bit bigger. Let's try. Okay. So you may remember this translation that I downloaded. These are not my translations. I don't take credit for them. Bereshit bara Elohim, and the usual standard translation, in the beginning God created, or as a lot of modern would say, when God began creating. So Rabbi Tanhuma opened with the verse from Psalms. You know, he gets up in front of his congregation. He says, quote Psalms, "For you are great and you perform wonders." Rabbi Tanhum said, with a pouch, you know, they had, that's how they store wine, right? You make a leather pouch. If you puncture a hole in its side with a pin, all its air comes out of it. Whereas a person who is made with all kinds of hollows and holes, and his air does not leave his body, who can make such a thing? You, God alone. So Psalm 86:10 says, "For you are great, you perform wonders, you, God alone." So he says that this is a reference to God's great acts of creation. God created human beings. We have all kinds of openings in our body, but our air doesn't come out. We don't deflate despite those. Now, on the other hand, a human being, if they made such a thing, it would collapse. So now, as this midrash goes on, it's, as I say, it's really a collection of different pieces from different rabbis. Question is asked, when were the angels created? Right? If you remember, there's nowhere in the Bible that says when angels are created. And since the rabbis clearly want to make sure that we understand that angels did not pre-exist creation, although there are other places where it sounds like they did. Rabbi Yochanan said the angels were created on the second day, just as it says in Psalms 104:4. By the way, the person teaching this would not have quoted the Psalm. He wouldn't say Psalm 104 verse 4. He just quote the verse. He sets the rafters of the upper chambers in the water. Right, that's creating the sky and the upper waters, which God does on the second day. And then it is written, he makes the winds his messengers, or his angels. So he says, if you look at the verse from Psalms, he says he set up the rafters of the upper chambers, which is talking about creating the sky. And then he creates his messengers, his angels. So when did God create angels? On the second day. Rabbi Hanina said, the angels were created on the fifth day. He says, no, you're wrong. I got a different interpretation. Where it is written, let the bird fly, Ye'ofef, across the earth. All right, so in the story of the fifth day, God creates birds and uses the language Ye'ofef, across the earth, fly across the earth. In Isaiah 6:2 it is written, and with two wings he, the angel, would fly, Ye'ofef. So the use of those words in both places gives rise to the interpretation that it's a reference to the creation of angels. Now it goes on. Rabbi Luliana Bar Tavrin said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, whether according to the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, or whether according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, all agree they were not created on the first day. So they could not say that the angel Michael or Michael stretched out the south end of the sky and Gabriel the north end, and the Holy One, blessed be he, measured out the middle. Rather, as it says in Isaiah, I am God who makes all, and who alone stretches out the heavens, with only myself, me'iti, or me'iti. So they want to read the word me'iti as if it were written me'iti, who is with me? Who partnered with me in the creation of the world? Now you have to understand, Midrash is a creative a solution usually to a problem. And if you think about, I like to use this analogy. Where do pearls come from? Other than the store, the jewelry store, right? Pearls come from an oyster, right? Well, how does a pearl get inside the oyster? Well, what happens is some kind of grit, some kind of disturbance gets in that oyster, and the oyster salivates on it, or it exudes something that gets on that piece of grit, smooths it out, and makes it more bearable for the oyster. So Midrash is, there's something wrong, something bothering the rabbis in a verse. And they seek to resolve that problem in some way. So we have two problems that are going on here, or three. The first problem is a theological problem. Namely, the idea that the rabbis want to stress that there is only one creator of heaven and earth, God. The angels have nothing to do with it. Since the angels have nothing to do with it, and the Torah, the Bible, never says God created the angels, we have to find some kind of hook to explain how and or when the angels were created. So we start off with a couple attempts based upon looking at verses in the Bible and playing with the words there to suggest what day of the 7 days of creation the angels were created. Now, the last passage, which says, no matter what, everybody agrees the angels were not created on the first day, is also got the same problem, but he looks at the fact that in Hebrew, if we don't have vowel signs, which the Bible did not, okay, all we got are consonants. And the consonants can sometimes be read one way or another way. So myself, May et, Mem Aleph Tav Yud, right, it can be read as not May et, but me et. Not from me, but who is with me. Thus saying that only God could have created the world, not somebody else. So then it goes, another interpretation. For you are great and you do wonders. It is the way of the world that a king of flesh and blood, and this is also frequently found in Midrash, they'll compare God, the ultimate king, to a king of flesh and blood. In the way of the world that a king of flesh and blood is praised in the land, and the great men of the land are praised with him, for they carry his burden with him. The prayer for our country, for Canada, in the traditional formulation of that prayer, begins with we ask God's blessings, Her Majesty the Queen and her ministers. Obviously it's a little more, the reality is a little more common, but that's, the traditional idea. The prime minister is the first minister of the Queen, right? That's in theory of our parliamentary system, all right? So the praise for the prime minister is because he is working for the Queen. Okay? So his praise comes because we're praising the Queen. But the Holy One, blessed be he, is not like this. Rather, he alone created the world. He alone is praised in the world. He is alone is glorified in his world. Rabbi Tanchuma said, for you are great and you do wonders. Why? Because you, God alone created the world. So here you have one form of Midrash Agadah, trying to resolve when angels were created, trying to teach a theological idea that God alone created the world without any angelic helpers, and using verses from different parts of the Bible, the Tanakh, to elucidate the passages in Genesis. Right? This is homiletical Midrash Agadah. Now this next one is the Mechilta Rabbi Shmuel, and this is a more legal Midrashic attempt. All right, so we read in Exodus 12:2, this month shall be to you the beginning of months. Rabbi Yishmael says, Moses pointed out the new moon to Israel and said to them, thus shall it look. And the new month be designated thereby for all generations. So the Midrash saying, what do you mean? When it says this month shall be to you, what do you mean this month shall be to you? Why not this month is the beginning of months? But the word month, chodesh, really means new moon. So Rabbi Yishmael says, this new moon. So what do you mean this new moon? So he says, it's like Moses, and elsewhere it says God to point out to Moses. But here it says, as we'll see in a minute, Moses told the elders of Israel, said, pointing to the new moon, This is what it's going to look like. Now, Rabbi Akiva says, on the other hand, this is one of the three things that Moses could not visualize until they were pointed out to him by the Lord. Likewise, we had in Leviticus 11:29, this shall be unclean for you among all the things that swarm upon the earth. Now, until God showed him what they were, Moses didn't know what it was. And another one, and this is the work of the menorah. All of these cases, Rabbi Akiva says God had to show it to Moses. Others say he was likewise perplexed as to slaughtering. In other words, how are we supposed to properly slaughter an animal? Others say, excuse me, and the answer is, and so it says in Numbers, and this is what you shall do upon the altar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, were not all of the mitzvot spoken to Moses in daytime? Wait a minute, I got a problem here, guys. We have a tradition that says the mitzvot were given to Moses only during the daytime, not at night. If that's the case, how could God show the moon to Moses? You can't see the moon during the day. So Rabbi Lazar, who's his son, says he spoke with him just before it got dark and showed it to him when it got dark. So he's speaking to Moses just before sunset. And the new moon is just there right after the sun sets. So God says to Moses during still daylight hours, this is what you have to do. And then the sun sets and he points out the moon. So this is kind of more of a homiletical, but then it turns to the following. This is still part of that. The beginning of the months. We are hereby apprised that Nisan is the beginning for the month. So it says in the passage in Exodus that this is the beginning of the months. And that teaches us that when we count months of the year, that we begin counting from the month of Nisan. So in Midrash says, and whence to derive the same for the reign of kings? And because it says in 1 Kings 6:1, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is Iyar, the 2nd month, his reign having begun with the 1st month Nisan. Since Iyar is called the 2nd month, it must mean that it was the 2nd month of his reign, therefore his reign began in Nisan. And whence to derive the same for festivals? And as a commentary that was printed with this says that as one is not in transgression delaying his vows until 3 consecutive festivals have passed. And if I make a vow, I've got 3 Yom Tovim, 3 festivals to fulfill it, but they have to be in order. And it says from Devarim, the festival of Matzot and Nisan, the festival of Shavuot, and the festival of Sukkot. We find then that Nisan is the beginning for months, for kings, and for festivals. Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Tzadok say also for house rentals. So if a person says, I'm renting you a house for the year, when does the year begin? You know, we today, we say whatever you signed the contract. No, they had a standard reckoning, which is if I say I'm renting for a year, the understanding is until the beginning of Nisan. Nisan is the time all rentals change hands. But this does not apply to the reckoning of the years, the Shemitah years, or Yovlot, or the 50-year period, or the laws dealing with planting. Because it says there in Devarim, at the end of 7 years, the time of the year of Shemitah, when all of Israel, etc., the festival and gathering, the circuit of the year, with reference to Sukkot. So here we have an elucidation, midrashic elucidation of passages in the book of Exodus that tells us about the laws of the calendar. Now, the Mishnah isn't organized this way. Because, you know, for example, we know that as we see here, we have passages quoted from later books of the Bible. We have passages quoted from other books of the Torah. How do you know where to find the law? You know, Wikipedia hadn't been invented yet. So I want to know what the rules are for a month. So it's not so simple that way. So around the rabbis also took and separated rules and regulations from the Torah itself and put them together and organized them. And finally, they were organized in the final form, more or less, by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda, who was the head of the rabbis of that period. So we'll finish with this in a moment, because this is a Mishnah in the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, the tractate Rosh Hashanah, that goes over the same things that we just saw in this Midrash. And now the source that I have for the English explains everything. So I put it in the bold print, the actual words of the Mishnah, and the explanations are in the smaller print in this example. So it's Rosh Hashanah. There are 4 new years. On the 1st of Nisan is New Year for kings and for the festivals. Okay, we saw that above. On the 1st of Elul is the new year for animal tithes. You skip the, all right, forget the all. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say on the 1st of Tishrei. So we have a disagreement when we have animals. In other words, an animal that's born before the 1st of Elul, according to the first rabbis, those animals are tithed for that year. If the animal is born after that time, it goes on next year's taxes, as it were. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say it's the 1st of Tishrei. So they disagree on when the tax year is. On the 1st of Tishrei is the new year for years, for calculating sabbatical years and jubilee years. We just saw that in the Midrash, for planting and for vegetables. On the 1st of Shvat is the new year for the tree. We didn't have that in there. In accordance with the statement of Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel says on the 15th of Shvat. Okay, so this covers the same ground that Midrash did, but it has it without reference to any of the biblical passages. In general, as we'll see, the Mishnah doesn't cite the Torah basis for the law. It just discusses the law. Occasionally we have biblical quotations, but we'll see. Next week, we will look at some more Mishnayot.
I'm teaching you how to speak English.
I'm sorry. Hello? Was that a question? We will look at some other Mishnayot, see how they're structured, and then we'll look at some Talmudic passages just to give you a feel how the Talmud deals with these things, and Rashi. I don't know if we'll get to it next week or not, but there, after the close of the Talmud, we have continuation of rabbinic literature. We have commentaries, Rashi and Tosafot, for example. We have law codes that we have to talk about. And we also have what we call Sheilot Shuvot, response to literature, questions that are asked of rabbis. For example, is brain death an acceptable determination in Jewish law when a person has died? Can you have transplant organs, etc.? And there are questions being asked today. And when this pandemic came about, questions were asked of leading rabbis. How should synagogues deal with the fact that you couldn't come to the synagogue? Are you allowed to have broadcast of services? Can you broadcast services on Shabbat and Yom Tov? If you don't do it, what about saying Kaddish? Can a person at home watching a broadcast, can they say Kaddish? Can you have a minyan because you have 10 people watching your broadcast? Does that constitute a minyan? These are all questions that had to be answered and dealt with in the last couple of years. And just one final, do I have an obligation to be vaccinated? What is the law? Do I have to follow the stricture about vaccination? Okay, so we'll see how far we get next week. And I'm not expecting you to remember all these passages, but I want to share them with you. I just want to share them with you so you have a feel for what it's all about. You do need to understand what the Mishnah is, what the Midrash is, what the Talmud is, and how the Midrash connects straight with the Torah. The Talmud is elucidating and elaborating and adding to what's found in the Mishnah. Law codes are the summary of what the laws are without all the give and take. And responsa are questions and answers to problems in Jewish tradition and practice. Okay? Any questions about tonight? Everybody is sound asleep already? All right. So I will say goodnight to everyone and see you all next week, God willing. Okay? Good night.
Good night.